Hello class, welcome to our next lecture presentation, which will be focusing exclusively on research methods. But before I get into that lecture, let me just highlight a couple of important things. A number of you have reached out to me with regards to attendance policy while we're doing this online iteration of introductory psychology. And of course, you don't have to log in every single day. As I already pointed out in my syllabus and previous email correspondence, Blackboard logs all students' activity. And so I get activity summaries as to, the frequency with which a student logs in and is reviewing important material. I'm not interested in whether you log in every day or even 2 days for that matter. What I am interested in is that you demonstrate by going into Blackboard for the appropriate amount of time that demonstrates that you are reviewing my video and you're reviewing all the relevant material. And in particular, reviewing the material from the OpenStax text. That is Psych version 2E. So really, it's not like you don't have to be there every day. You don't even have to be there every other day. But you need to be in there for a sustained period of time at your convenience, demonstrating that that you are being exposed to the material. And besides, your performance on the exam is going to depend on that. Now, we're going to talk about our first exam a little bit later, probably sometime next week, because that's just around the corner. Today I'm starting on research methods, and the following lecture is going to be on learning, and then we're going to have our first exam. So like I said, it's right around the corner. Anyway, so if you have any other questions or issues, please reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions. My apologies if there's be some ambiguity about certain kinds of things in the class, but because our interaction is always constant, albeit taped or what we call encore demand, your questions will always be answered, and any ambiguities really cleared up. Okay, so good. So here we are in research methods, and you recall when I defined psychology in my previous lecture, it was the scientific study. This is the part of psychology that is most important. Why? Why is research important? Well, at one time in history, people believed that the earth was flat and that mental illness were caused by possession. One commonly applied technique that we know from skull findings is a technique called trephining. I believe your textbook describes that. Holes were made in the skulls of individuals, presumably with the intent of letting spirits get out. And ouch, I could only imagine how painful that must have been. But I suppose that if you had someone who was acting a little crazy and then someone made a hole in their head, that somehow whatever symptoms they were displaying, severe agitation and so forth, was probably almost obliterated. And for that matter, if trephining killed 50% of your of the people who were treated with it, you might call that a failure, but someone might say, well, that's a 50% success rate, which highlights the importance of scientific research and research methodology. The point is being that people can be very wrong in their ideas about the world, and when they do not rely on evidence to support their claims, we end up with a lot of misleading beliefs, erroneous ideas, misassumptions, misinformation, and so forth, which incidentally is a problem in this country today, misinformation. But we're not going to get into that right now. It's beyond the scope of our class. But anyway, let me start out by saying that research is a mandatory process in validating claims. Scientific research is empirical. It is grounded in objective, tangible evidence that can be observed time and time again, regardless of who is observing. We call that objective evaluation. Without research, we would only have intuition and groundless assumptions. Through research, we are able to prove certain ideas through study and testing. Now, perhaps you recall from my first lecture that I directed you to some material in the folder. These are supplementary slides. I think I mentioned that to you before. If not, I'm mentioning it now. So forgive my redundancy if I did mention it before. But in it, a couple of the slides show what we deem as pseudoscientific areas of interest. Things that give the appearance of being scientific, but they're really not. They kind of like surround themselves with scientific jargon and so forth. But when true scientific method is applied to them, these findings or the claims and assumptions that underlie it just simply evaporate. See, without research methods, we would only have intuition and groundless assumptions. And through research, we are able to prove certain ideas through study and testing. After all, psychology is a science. Therefore, research is required to not only further investigate something, but provide verification and support of the findings. So, use of research information. Thinking critically about claims. Well, what do we mean by critical thinking? That is also highlighted in that supplemental PowerPoint slide that I put in there. So please review that carefully. But even generally, more broadly, thinking critically about any claim, any scientific claim, is first, what is the expertise of the person making the claim? What is the expertise of the person making the claim? What might they gain if the claim is valid? Does the claim seem justified given the evidence? And what do other researchers think of the claim? Now, this is such an important part in the beginning of critical thinking, because if we apply those fundamental premises, then we avoid, again, falling into or being drawn into those things that we simply like or we find attractive. Now, take astrology, for example. I know all of you know your birth signs and so forth, but the truth is that astrology has absolutely no basis in science, because every time any of the premises in it are brought to the test, they just simply fall apart. Well, anyway, the process of scientific research always includes inductive and deductive reasoning. So what I want to do here is compare the two, inductive versus deductive reasoning. In deductive reasoning, the results are predicted based on starting out with a general premise. Here, all living things require energy to survive, right? That's a premise. Ducks are living things. Therefore, ducks require energy to survive, which is a conclusion. See how that works? We start out with a general premise, and then what we do is we see some evidence that tends to support that, and then we draw the conclusion. Well, again, if all living things require energy to survive, and ducks are living things, ducks require energy to survive. That sounds very sound and very, very rational. And that does work in science up to a certain extent. More contributing to scientific reasoning is what we call inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning. These are conclusions that are drawn from observations. You see many fruit growing on trees and therefore assume all fruits grow trees. Now, there is always a fixed process which includes both cycling inductive and deductive reasoning, and I think this is kind of like highlighted in your textbook. First, we start. Scientists form ideas. We call them theories and hypotheses. More on that a little later. And we do that through deductive reasoning. It's almost like you scratch your chin and you're saying, you know, I think this is an interesting thing, or that's an interesting that, and you know, and so forth. And and then we encapsulate these ideas using deductive reasoning. But then we formulate hypotheses, which are then tested through empirical observations. This is the inductive part. And scientists form conclusions through this inductive reasoning process. These conclusions lead to new theories and hypotheses, or more broad generalizations. Again, I cannot overemphasize the fact that psychological research relies on both inductive and deductive reasoning. Well, let's talk about the scientific method. Scientists use inductive to form theories which then generate hypotheses. Well, what is a theory? A theory is a well-developed set of ideas that proposes an explanation for some observed phenomena. Hypotheses are tentative and testable statements, or rather predictions, that draw from the theories. You might say that hypotheses are like little pieces of the theory that are taken out and then tested with regards to their predictive possibilities. And it's generally about the relationship between two or more variables. Generally, hypotheses predict how the world will behave if the theory is correct. Usually, an if-then statement is falsifiable, capable of being to be incorrect. Falsifiability is such an important part of the application of the scientific method, because it is just as important to prove that something is not true as it is true. The scientific method of research includes proposing hypotheses, conducting research, and creating or modifying theories based on these results. Now, let's talk about various approaches to research, because we have several of them. And the ones I'm going to describe to you now fall broadly under the heading of methodologies, because what we're doing here is we're identifying our variables and figuring out how we're going to measure them. Because if you're going to study something, even rather descriptively, as just describing the variables, you have to know what it is that you're studying. And I think your textbook does a fine job in bringing forth all those major points. So let me enumerate some of them that I'm going to break out for you in just a few moments. We have clinical or case studies, naturalistic observations, surveys, archival research, and longitudinal and cross-sectional research. Let's talk about clinical or case studies. Excuse me. Clinical or case studies focus on one individual or very, very few individuals. And the studied individually is typically in an extreme or unique psychological circumstance that differentiates them from the general public. It allows for a lot of insight into a case. However, it is difficult to generalize results to the larger population because you're talking about so few. I believe your textbook uses a girl by the name of Jeannie as an example. Jeannie was studied by psychologists after she was found at age 13 having suffered severe abuse and social isolations. Psychologists were interested in the effect of social isolation had on her. So as you might imagine, you study Jeannie extensively. You might interview the parents, if available, siblings, or anyone who knows her. Now, another form is observations of behavior in its natural setting. We call this naturalistic behavior. And naturalistic observation also plays a very, very important part in the science of psychology. And heck, you've seen that on cable television, or perhaps in your social media feeds. Behavior of lions in the natural wild, the behavior of giraffes in the natural wild. I use those as some of the most easiest examples. To see, the thing about naturalistic behavior is generally hidden under scrutiny or observation. In other words, when you are observing behavior in a natural setting, you do not want that which is being observed to know that you're observing. And I think you could kind of intuitively feel why that would be. When you when the thing that's being observed knows it's being observed, their behavior very, very well may change. Look, you see a police car behind you, it would probably affect your driving behavior, right? Okay. To study the most accurate and genuine behaviors, naturalistic observations has proven to be most effective. And through naturalistic observations, any feeling of performance or anxiety the studied individual is eliminated. However, we do have to be mindful of observer bias. Now, another very, very important part of psychological investigations, something that we call surveys. So please read very carefully in your chapter 2 of the text. And essentially in surveys, we create a list of questions that can be delivered in many different ways. Paper and pencil, electronically, verbally. A very common way of deploying surveys these days is through the internet. And surveys can be used to gather a large amount of data from a subset of individuals from a larger population. Surveys can be administered in a number of ways. Like I said, electronically administered research. In fact, the college has a research gathering system. Very frequently, the internet is used to deploy. Another form of research is called archival research. We use past records or data sets to answer various research questions or to search for interesting patterns or relationships. You know, in an area called political psychology, which by the way I teach, archival research is essentially the cornerstone of creating what we call psychobiographies, where we attempt to understand the personalities of political figures by by discussing with the relevant individuals the history of the individuals. I can't begin to tell you how many books there are on Donald Trump. One in particular written by Mary L. Trump, which is Donald Trump's niece. And then, I think every other month another book regarding Donald Trump comes out. Anyway, so much for archival research. What we also have, and it's spelled out in your text, so please read the section very carefully, something called longitudinal and sectional research. In cross-sectional research, we compare multiple segments of a population at a single time, but using different age. In a longitudinal study, the same group of individuals is surveyed and measured repeatedly over an extended period of time. Researchers often expect some participants to drop out, particularly in that type of study, and therefore often initially recruit a lot of participants. Trying to keep dropout rates minimal, if they can be helped, is very, very important. We call that process, which is the reduction in number of research participants as some drop out of the study, as attrition over time. Longitudinal research helps us to better understand a variety of things, such as the relationship between cancer and smoking. That's just one example. One very important part of descriptive methodological research is something called correlational research, which actually relies on establishing relationships between two or more variables. When two variables are correlated, and that is one variable changes as the other changes, we call that a correlation. Now, from that relationship between two or sometimes more variables, we apply mathematical formula called the Pearson product moment correlation, and then there are other different types of correlations, but we end up with a number that expresses the degree that two variables are related. We call that a correlation coefficient. And by the way, you should mention this, and it's reinforced sufficiently in your textbook, that a correlation coefficient can only fall between -1 and +1. That's not because there's anything magical about -1 or +1. It's just that the mathematical formula is devised to express the strength of the relationship between those two parameters. The closer that you are to +1 or -1 indicates the strength and direction of the relationship. If the correlation is negative and moves closely towards -1, we say that it is a negative correlation. When the two variables are changing in the same direction, both becoming larger or smaller, we say that it is a positive correlation. Students frequently confuse negative and positive correlation, for some reason thinking that positive correlation is the stronger of the two. And nothing could be further than the truth, because a negative 0.91 is a stronger correlation than a positive 0.82. Get it? Now, if you look at your textbook, there are scatter plots that are illustrated in there showing a very, very common correlation that we see, the correlation between height and weight, and also illustrated as a negative correlation. A negative relationship can be found between the hours of sleep and the level of tiredness. In other words, the less sleep that you get, the more tired you are going to believe. And if you look at that illustration in the relationship between hours of sleep and tiredness, you see that it tends to high goes with low, low goes with high, and so forth. And by the way, when a correlation comes very, very close to zero, we say basically there is no correlation. Now, it's beyond the scope of this class to talk about statistical significance. That's something that we cover in more advanced research methodologies, and those of you who end up taking a more advanced class in psychology will get into that in more detail. Because when is a correlation meaningful? When is it just meaningless? This is where statistical significance comes in, and we want to say that well, some correlations are so small that they're pretty close to zero. We believe that there's a very, very strong possibility, even without any statistical application, that there is really probably no relationship between the two. But that's a point that made in a more advanced class. But this is a very important point that you should understand about correlations. Correlation indicate causation. Now, what do we mean by causation? We're talking about cause and effect relationships, and that is changes in one variable causes the change in another variable. And that can only be determined through an experimental research design, which includes setting up independent variables, identifying dependent variables, and we'll get into that in just a few moments. But a very important part of understanding relationships between variables is what we call a confounding variable, and in part reasons why we do experiments employing experimental research design. Because there's the possibility of an unanticipated outside factor that affects both variables of interest. And these often give the false impressions that changes in one variable causes changes in the other variable. This is the problem that is inherent in correlations. Two variables could be correlated, but it could be that a third, not measured variable is causing both. And that's why we always have to be careful. Correlations does not indicate causation. Only an experiment can reveal that. Anyway, let me give you some examples of relationships and see if you could understand it. As ice cream sales increase, so does the overall rate in crime. A relationship exists between ice cream and crime, but is it correlation, or does one cause the other? That's almost absurd to say ice cream sales causes an increase in crime, or for that matter, that an increase in crime causes an increase in ice cream sales. It's just patently absurd. But therein lies two of the issues that underlie the problems of correlation. And one is the reversibility, like A causes B or B causes A. We just don't know. Or the third variable problem, which I've already kind of alluded to, is there a third variable that's possibly causing A or causing B? We just don't know. Now, some other issues with correlations, right? And in some cases, they end up plaguing psychological research, sometimes within the clinical setting. It's something called illusory correlations. And that is relationships between variables that seem to exist, but they really don't. As well as mistaking correlation for causation, people can also make false correlations. We call them illusory correlations because we see relationships between two things when in reality no such relationship exists. Okay? A number of years ago, clinical developmental psychologists were doing draw picture tests for children, and some came up with a relationship between the tendency to draw large belt buckles in the pictures, and had argued that the tendency to draw these large belt buckles was a reflection of insecurity in the child. And a lot of clinical developmental psychologists were saying that there's this relationship between the two, and further experimental investigation revealed that just is simply not the case. Another issue that we have also, and it's also a problem in scientific methods per se, is called confirmation bias. It's a tendency to ignore evidence that disproves ideas or beliefs. Now, we have built into research methodology safeguards against that. We call that strong inference. I'm not going to get into that here. That's a matter of advanced experimental psychology. But strong inference, when rigorously applied to experimental methodology, tends to virtually eliminate confirmational bias. But you could read a little more about that than in your textbook. Anyway, but let's get back to the whole notion of causality, because this is why we conduct experiments, and it's why we create and use data. The only way to establish that there is a cause and effect relationship between two variables is to conduct a scientific experiment. And the scientific experiment has precise requirements for designs and implementations. We call this the experimental hypothesis. Hypotheses, and you recall I kind of like gave you a quick definition of a hypothesis and how it draws from the theory. It's a statement about the relationship between two or more variables, and the goal of a hypothesis is in virtually most cases is to make predictions. You know, what this variable is going to cause an effect or produce a change in that variable. But hypotheses are generally formulated through observations and also after review of previous research. Well, when we are designing an experiment, we have experimental and control groups, and they're very, very, very important. In fact, an experiment without a control group is really not an experiment at all. An experimental group is that group that is getting the treatment, the participants that experience the manipulated variable. It is the group designed to answer the research question. Now, the experimental group always must be compared with a control group, and that is the participants that do not experience the manipulated variable. This is well explained inside your textbook. It's basis for comparison and controls for chance factors that might influence the result of the study. Experimental manipulation is the only difference between the experimental and control groups. So any differences between the two are due to experimental manipulation rather than chance. Now, defining variables and how they will be measured. Well, we have something called an operational definition. It's a description of what actions and operations will be used to measure the dependent variables and manipulate the independent variables. And let me just cycle back. A point I'm going to make again after anyway. An independent variable is the variable that you, the investigator, purposely manipulates. You change it. You may change the level of a drug dose. You may change the level of a particular kind of treatment. Let's say it's the number of weeks in a psychiatric treatment, right? 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. Okay, that would be by definition an independent variable. The dependent variable is the variable that you are examining very carefully to see if it changes as a result of your manipulation. A good way to always separate the two is always remember the dependent variable relies on what you're doing with the independent variable. Well, there's a very, very important reason why we have a control condition. And again, it's because without it, we don't know what to compare it to. I suppose it's a good point for me to give you a simple example. You know, many, many years ago, there was this centuries ago, I should say, there was this French battle surgeon by name of Pare, Dr. Pare, P-A-R-E. And his job was basically to treat battlefield wounds, which at that particular time commonly was amputation. And if you sustained a serious enough injury in one of your limbs, the only thing you really could do was cut off the limb. And so what was very, very important was how you treated the limb after, the remaining part of the limb after it is amputated. And what Pare used to do was pour oil, boiling oil, very, very hot, heated boiling oil over the wound. And it had a mortality rate of about 65%. And for Pare's understanding of the results, 35% survival rate was pretty good. But compared to what? Because Pare couldn't compare it to anything. But anyway, what happened in one interesting circumstance was Pare ran out of oil. And he continued to treat these individuals without applying the oil. He unwittingly created a control group, the group that didn't get the oil. And guess what Pare found? Pare found that the mortality rate dropped from 65% to 35%. How is that for a change? Demonstrating the fact that just having effects in just one group really doesn't tell you very much at all. You need that control group. Now let's talk a little bit about designing an experiment and avoiding bias and understanding the role of the placebo effect, which is also well covered in your text. Experimenter bias is the bias that the researcher has, which is essentially expectations of how the study is going to end up, and it tends to skew the results of the study. The experimenter bias is frequently unintended, in the sense that the experimenter is completely unaware of how that bias operates. But trust me, having done quite a bit of research over all my years, experimenter bias is very, very real and very, very powerful. But then there is something that we call participant bias. And this is when the individual who's participating in the study has expectations, some of it trying to figure out what the study is about. That affects the result. So now enter safeguards against these kinds of biases and minimizing what we will call the placebo effect. I'm going to formally define that in a moment. We have single blind studies. This is where the experimenter, in which researcher knows which participants are in the experimental group and which are in the control group, but participants do not. And that kind of experiment, the single blind study, controls for participant expectations, so sometimes called expectancy bias. But more appropriate is the creation and the deployment of double-blind studies. In double-blind studies, it's an experiment in which both the researcher and the participants are blind, do not know who is going into what group, who is going to be in the control group, and who is going to be in the experimental group. And this is very, very important. If you adhere to those things, those kinds of biases that I alluded to, and in particular the placebo effect, is kept to a minimum. But I should add that biases are almost never brought down to zero. That's why replicating a study sometimes very, very important. And frequently, we do a study and we exert our best efforts in trying to control the experimental investigation, and then we repeat it, and you know something? The effect is gone. Does that mean that science was bad or science has failed? Absolutely not. That is a natural process of science, which is also to say, guess what? With regards to results, sometimes, but not always, here today, gone tomorrow. It's very important that you understand this is not a weakness of science. In fact, that's what makes science particularly strong. But let's talk about the placebo effect. You see, people have expectations or beliefs, and they influence or determine their experience in any given situation. You know what that's like. It's not hard to reflect on your own personal expectations and how it's influenced your behavior. Take, for example, when people are given a pill to improve their mood may increase just because they believe it will. If you look at that PowerPoint stuff that I put on there with regard to pseudosciences, you'll see that I have there an illustration of a particular product called Head On, right? You rub this thing on your forehead, and it was said to get rid of headaches. And without getting into it in much detail, they found that to be just a whole bucket of hooey. First, no real experiment was done to that, but it had very, very strong placebo effect, because people who applied this material to their forehead swore that about an hour later their headaches were completely obliterated. But I quite assure you that if I were to give you an unscented deodorant and tell you that it was a headache remedy, wrapped it in calling it some other kind of product, and I had you apply it to your forehead and telling you that in 30 minutes, whatever's hurting in your head is going to disappear, about 65% of you are going to claim relief after that. That is the extent of the power of the placebo effect. It doesn't mean that you're stupid. It doesn't mean that you're naive. It happens. And that's why we always have to build safeguards in it. See, when people are given a pill to improve their mood may increase just because they believe it will, as I just said. And if you know, if you take a medication and it's really having an effect, or whether it's a placebo effect, the experimental group receives the medication and the control group receives the placebo. Okay. Now, your textbook may describe a sugar pill. You should understand, a sugar pill is not a placebo. A sugar pill is just an inert material that looks exactly like the drug that you might be taking, except it doesn't contain the actual drug in itself. In a double-blind study, any differences between the groups will be due to the medication. All right, you've heard me toss a couple of terms out here and there, so let me kind of like define them for you here. Variables, okay? You've already heard me allude to an independent variable and a dependent variable. An independent variable, as I mentioned earlier, is the one that's controlled by the experimenter. And ideally, this should be the only important difference between the experimental and the control group. The dependent variable is that variable, as I've already mentioned again, that the researcher measures to see how much effect it has on the independent variable. In an experiment, manipulations of the independent and dependent variables are expected to result in changes. Independent variables are expected to result in changes in the dependent variables. Other concepts worth noting here: selecting participants, sometimes called subjects. These are the main, especially in psychology, the area of investigation, so forth. And Actually, I'm just noticing over here, oh my God, we're 36 minutes. And I think I've told you in the past, I like to try and keep these things down to even less. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop at this particular point because I've covered a good part of the chapter, and I'm going to ask you to continue reviewing the rest of this chapter. I'm going to stop because I know how this sometimes happens. You just get bored to the dickens with very, very lengthy lectures. So, all right, I think I've covered most of the stuff, but that does not mean what I have not covered at this point should be discarded. Continuing reading that chapter. Remember chapter 1 and chapter 2, and I consider chapter 2 one of the most important chapters of the entire text. So I'm going to say adieu for now, and keep reading. Go ahead and read into the section on learning. Next week, I'm going to introduce a lecture on learning, and I'm going to ask you to read that chapter, and kudos to you if you've already began reading it. And see you later. Don't hesitate to reach out to me, and because I will get back to you as soon as possible. Ciao for now.